Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, can I apologise for not being there in person? I had intended to be there, as I'm sure Leslie and Mark have explained, but circumstances detained me here on the West Coast and I couldn't get back to Scotland in time, so my apologies for that. I did think, however, I'd try and send this recording to you because I wanted to share with you some thoughts about what I've been seeing and hearing over the last couple of months as I've been travelling around the world discussing economic development, job creation, and the creation of economic value added within economies. And I thought some of these lessons were very pertinent to what Scotland's trying to achieve. I based this primarily on the strategy, the economic strategy which Mark and Leslie had sent me, and which I enjoyed reading very much. The four pillars of that strategy are quite clear. The 4 I's, I think, is what they've been called. And I thought I'd discuss each of those I's and give you a perspective from my point of view about what you see globally that not simply reinforces the importance of each one of those, but actually tells you a perspective that perhaps you can take on it to make it more viable for what you're trying to achieve in Scotland. Firstly, I want to start off with the idea of investing in people and infrastructure. I think looking at the world economic situation over the last couple of years and looking at what's developing, and some of the stats around this are quite astonishing. We sit in a world right now where about 8,000 companies with a turnover of over $1 billion each control, roughly speaking, about 70% of global trade. Their supply chains obviously contribute to that, but they themselves are driving this. And when you look at those organizations and you think about what's going to happen in the future, you realize that people and infrastructure are the key assets that they use. In fact, in a survey of 800 of those companies that we conducted in PEA, 500 in what we call the developed markets and 300 in the emerging markets, mostly from Southeast Asia, the singular biggest issue that they brought forward was about access to markets, access to clients, and then thirdly, access to natural or human resources that could actually fulfill the tasks that those companies wanted to achieve. That's quite astonishing and plays very much to the first point of the strategy about investing in people and infrastructure. However, what makes it even more pertinent is the fact that between now and 2025, the total number of companies in the world that will exceed $1 billion turnover will rise to about 15,000, almost a doubling. And the interesting thing about those particular companies is that they will not be names that we recognize. Out of the 8,000 companies that exist in the world today meeting that criterion, we probably recognize or could recognize a lot of the names. They come from North America, of course, they come from the established economies in Europe, and the emerging economies coming out of South Korea, Japan, obviously, and China. The interesting thing is that there are new companies out there that are growing fast, and they're growing fast and we don't know their names. But we're going to find out their names over the next decade. And significantly, what those companies will seek is environments where they can find people and resources that can fulfill the tasks that they need to do to be successful. So it strikes me that although you can provide through infrastructure access to markets and access to customers, the ability to build human resource capability that actually goes beyond what simply technology itself offers is going to be a critical defining factor. And those companies are going to be seeking those people, and if they can't find them in their own markets, which I think is probably unlikely, they're going to come to other markets to look for those. So that's the first point. The second point I want to talk about is innovation and R&D, which was the second strand of the strategy. I feel this is becoming more and more significant. I'm here on the west coast of North America at the moment with a large delegation of Chinese, Korean and Japanese companies, and we're having a discussion about what will matter over the next decade. And their points are quite clear about this. We have a global trend at the moment where the costs of capital and the costs of labour are equalising across the world. China is no longer a cheap source of labour. It's no longer a cheap source of capital. In fact, you see industries moving away from China because they're too expensive. And whilst they may be moving to South Korea or Indonesia in the short term, we know full well that there will be an accelerated cost of labour increasing in those markets, and the cost of management in those markets will mean that actually there will be an equalisation of where people are going to decide to place businesses or where they're going to do business with. And the overriding theme coming out of all of these companies that I'm talking about is they keep asking for ideas. Where are the next generation of innovations come from? Who's going to crack the next theme? And I often hear smaller economies say, well, it's not going to be us that does that because we're a small economy and the larger economies can do more R&D. And that's actually technically not true. They can do more of a type, but if you look at the singular focus areas of research and breakthrough innovations that occur globally at the moment, and even those that have been occurring in markets such as the United States, Germany, and the UK itself, what you find is they come out of very small teams. There are just lots more of those very small teams in market. So picking specific areas where Scotland can focus and can drive in real innovations and ideation about what those markets should become will be quite critical. And I think I would appreciate very much that second strand of the strategy, as its significance will become even more important over the next decade. The third point I want to make is about internationalisation. Now, I know this was not the third pillar in the strategy, but I want to leave the third pillar that was outlined in the strategy to later, and I want to talk about internationalisation first. Global supply chains are consolidating. I mentioned 70% of global trade will be formed over the top 500 companies in the world. Even if we have new companies coming into the fray, as I outlined earlier, there will still be a preponderance of trade through consolidated supply chains. That means you've got to be internationalised to survive. You can't simply take a local perspective, and companies that are starting or companies that are developing are going to have to think global, and they're going to have to think carefully. The one thing I'm beginning to learn about this, however, is that we often think about internationalisation, about being in individual markets. I think we're going to see a significant challenge in that in the next decade, and the reason I think that is that there are stepping stones to markets that will make it and reduce the cost of entering those markets. And it's interesting, I visited British Columbia earlier this week, and I spent some time with people there, and they were predominantly Chinese companies who used British Columbia as a launching pad into the North American market. And it struck me that there are other markets that could be used as launching pads into Malaysia, Indonesia, China itself, of course, and South Korea, that might not necessarily endure the same costs or barriers that we think we need to endure by simply going there ourselves. And that means we're going to have to form international partnerships with other countries and other cities that will enable us access to those markets so that our companies can internationalise. And when you sit in a geography like Scotland, you've got to have a serious think about that, because the collaborations that you form will be the collaborations that will give you access and amplification into those markets, which will be critical for internationalisation in the future. And the last strand of the strategy I really appreciated tremendously, given my own background, and that was that about inclusive growth and fair opportunities. There is a problem globally at the moment, and it was mentioned at Davos, at first in 2014, but significantly in 2015, where people started to talk about the power law and the disparity difference between those who were in employment and what they were earning and those who weren't. This is now becoming a global issue, whether you sit in China, whether you sit in Japan, or whether you sit in Germany or the UK. These challenges are going to get resolved over the next decade, and one way or the other, there's going to have to be a reckoning of the fact that economies are going to have to become a lot more caring and understand that inclusiveness and growth is much more important than simply growth itself. I think we also have to recognise that we are now entering an area where the world is technically shrinking. We've heard of that for some time, with telecoms and travel costs reducing, etc., and distance becoming less of a factor. But actually, the real way of where reduction is coming is around where people have ideas and understand how things can be done. And in doing that, and many people doubt this because they think the tech sector or the pharma sector and those show that they can develop ideas by themselves. But when you look underneath their hood at what their behaviour actually is, it is quite apparent that those organisations are trawling the earth, looking for places where they can find the best ideas. And that applies to countries like Latvia, it applies to provinces like British Columbia, it applies to countries that we may not have ever considered before, playing a significant role in the supply chains of those companies. And Scotland needs to see that as an ideal opportunity by combining the four factors and the four strands of those strategies, of the strategy that you've already articulated. In many respects, this is the most daunting time to think about economic development. But in many other respects, there has never been a time with more opportunities where you can actually start to show that you can lead the world by producing companies that are remarkable in what they can do, remarkable in their innovations, but still ethnically fixed where they came from, but playing on a global stage. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. I would have very much enjoyed further conversation about some of these points, and I imagine some of you might have questions based on this brief overview I've given you. But I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and I look forward to meeting you again sometime in the future. Thank you.